Hi, I'm Paul Peterson.
I'm Chris Sun Liu. This is part 2 of the Bureaucracy lecture, Historical Evolution of U.S. Bureaucracies. Professor Peterson, how do the beginnings of U.S. bureaucracies differ from those in other countries?
Well, Chris, the bureaucracies in the United States have a sort of dubious ancestry. They're not like the French bureaucracy, which had this wonderful palace in Versailles before the French Revolution. King Louis XIV built that magnificent palace mainly for his bureaucracy. And you have something quite similar, although more modest, in Tokyo. The Imperial Palace was the fountainhead for the bureaucracy that is created in the latter part of the 19th century for the Japanese nation, allowing it to modernize and become competitive with countries throughout the world. And of course, in Britain, you have Buckingham Palace, the changing of the guard. The bureaucracy is still regarded as servants to the Queen, and they have all the honors and privileges of working for Her Majesty. In the United States, we don't have that. We don't have such an elegant bureaucracy. We don't have any kings or emperors that we can point to as the source of our government.
Okay, so the U.S. bureaucracy does not have any sort of royal lineage, but it's part of the federal government, which is a venerable, honorable institution, isn't it?
Well, not really. Washington, D.C. was a swamp when the Constitution was signed. And at the beginning, they started off in New York and were in Philadelphia for a while. And it wasn't until 1800 that they finally made it down to Washington, D.C. The state of Virginia was so reluctant to give the District of Columbia its land that if you see on this map here, in the Constitution, it says that some land 10 miles square should be set aside for the federal government. But Virginia would never give up Alexandria or Arlington, and so that part of what was to become the national government never happened. So the District of Columbia is squeezed into this small shape on one side of the Potomac River, which is really swampland. And the only reason they got that land is because nobody else really wanted it. Now, living there was pretty awful at the beginning. According to one account that's been recorded by James Young in a book on Washington in the early years, the climate was intolerable. The place was a menace to health, pervaded with contaminated vapor, which brought out all manner of agues and other complaints. The cuisine was atrocious, hog and hominy grits, and not even any fruit fit for hogs to eat. The residential accommodations were narrow, uncomfortable, and expensive. Well, this isn't the city in 1790. It's looking a lot better by this time. This is when Abraham Lincoln is in power, and they're trying to finally finish building the Capitol. There was so much controversy that it took many, many years for this building to be completed.
So dubious ancestry clearly presents a problem for U.S. bureaucracies. What's another problem that adds to all these troubles?
Well, the spoils system got set up in the 1830s, 1840s. The slogan was, "To the victor go the spoils." When Andrew Jackson was elected president of the United States, he threw out all the existing bureaucrats and brought in his friends. And that tradition got well established in the 19th century. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing to have patronage in government. The custom houses, those were the places that decided what goods were to enter into the United States and what the tariff should be levied on each product that arrived. That was a great place to have a job because there are all kinds of opportunities to say, well, we'll give you a break on the tariff if you just slip me a dollar bill under the table. Well, Nathaniel Hawthorne had that job in Salem, Massachusetts. You can actually go up there and see that custom house today that he worked in. He spent most of his time writing his books, Scarlet Letter, House of Seven Gables. All that got accomplished there working for the United States government in a custom house that he got as patronage from a president that he had supported in the political campaign.
Now, what event eventually provided strong impetus for reforming the spoils system?
Well, the spoils system gradually gets undermined, and the beginnings start with the assassination of James Garfield, who was alleged to have been killed by a disappointed office seeker. He was actually a pretty crazy nut, but the media played it up. Charles Guiteau was his name, played him up to be a disappointed office seeker, and therefore something had to be done about this problem. It was leading to the assassination of presidents. Well, what made it especially terrible was that Chester Arthur, who becomes president upon Garfield's assassination, he was the vice president at the time, he was the very personification of the spoils system. He had worked in the New York Custom House. In fact, he was the head of it. It was the largest, most extensive patronage operation in the United States. Indeed, he was thought to have been a crook at one point in time. President Hayes had kicked him out of office. He managed to get back in. Somehow he managed to become vice president on the grounds that that was a job where he couldn't do any harm. And lo and behold, he becomes president of the United States.
And how did the Arthur administration start to make a dent in the spoils system?
Well, often it happens, Chris, that somebody who looks like the worst possible president to deal with a problem becomes the best possible president to deal with a problem. He had to do something about this spoils system for his administration to survive at all. So he encouraged the passage of the Pendleton Act, which made it through Congress. And that act created the Civil Service Commission. So you had to take examinations in order to work for the federal government. And here's somebody who actually looks like she passed the examination. Let's see, what does it say here? Take to the examination room pen, ink, pencil, and eraser, but no paper. Applicants for the typewriting, bookkeeping, drafting, or other examinations requiring the use of machines or implements must furnish such machines or implements for use during the examination. No freebies back then. If you want a job with the federal government, you got to bring your own pencils, paper, and typewriters.
How did these reforms, which made government jobs based on not patronage but merit, start to reach higher levels of government?
Yes, well, forgot to mention that these civil service commissions started off with the least important jobs as being civil service jobs because all the politicians wanted to keep the good jobs as part of the patronage system. So what happened was that the secretaries and the bookkeepers were the ones who got put into the civil service, where the decision makers were left out of it. But as time went on, each president, about the time that president's leaving office, especially if the other political party's coming in, would add some more positions to the civil service. So gradually, more and more positions were blanketed in. That's what they called it, blanketing in a position to be included in the civil service, and that way their patronage workers would be secure in their jobs even though the other political party was coming into power. So through strategies like this, we gradually get a much more extensive civil service commission or civil service practice in the United States.
Okay, so the Pendleton Act helps reduce patronage in terms of who gets jobs, but government employees can still participate in politics, right?
Well, not really. Not after 1939. Congress then passes the Hatch Act, which actually forbids federal employees from participating in politics. And that actually encourages the formation of employee organizations so they can start representing employees since they couldn't bargain on their own. And that law remains intact until 2012, when it's modified to some extent when Obama signs the Hatch Act, which limits the Hatch Act just to full-time federal employees who are not working for the District of Columbia government. So it still is keeping a lot of federal employees out of political activities.
Professor Peterson, almost a century and a half after the passage of the Pendleton Act, how does the amount of patronage in our governmental system today compare to the old spoils system of the past?
Well, the number of positions that are still patronage positions has been reduced enormously, especially in the federal government, but also in the state and local governments, though there are still more patronage opportunities at that level of government. As for the federal government, it's limited to the highest level positions in the government. The most responsible positions are still political appointees. They're still officially patronage positions that depend on your political connections. And that's actually increased in the last number of years. Between 1960 and 1992, the number of such appointments in each department increased from 20 to over 100. So that's a huge increase in the number of patronage appointments at the highest level of the U.S. government.
Do patronage appointees at least stay and serve in the government for a while?
Well, if you look at the Plum Book, and the Plum Book is where all the plum positions in the government are listed. These are the positions that are available to the president to be appointed as political appointees. And there's about 3,000 positions. They're highly desirable, but 25% of the appointees leave the government within 1 year. 25% of these Plum Book positions leave within 1 year. The average appointment is only 3 years. A lot of people call these plum positions positions held by inners and outers. Inners and outers are people who go into the government and then come out again, then they go back in again. A good example is Larry Summers, who was a Secretary of the Treasury in the Clinton administration. And then he left after a few years and went to Harvard and became the president for a while. And then when that didn't work out so well, he went back in and worked for the Obama administration in a different position. So he's a typical inner and outer. There's a lot of people like that. People who go into the government when their party is in power, then when the opposition party wins, they go out of government, then they go back in again another time. Now that's very distinct from what happens in Japan or in Britain or France or Germany, where if you work for the government, you can work yourself up to the top as part of the civil service, and you're going to make a total career out of this. This is going to be your lifetime responsibility. So we have inners and outers negotiating with people in other countries who have worked for the government for their entire life.
What are some of the arguments for and against this American system with our inners and outers?
Well, the best case for it is that it brings in new blood. It brings in new people who are brought in at the highest level. They're high energy individuals. They can introduce new ideas, new approaches quickly. They can get things done. The old-fashioned bureaucrat tends to be slow going, sees all kinds of problems with any new approach, and it's much more difficult to do anything working with a permanent bureaucracy. So presidents sort of like this high-level patronage system. But critics have noticed that these new employees often make mistakes. They have no sense of history, no sense of the difficulties of working with the bureaucracy. They find it difficult to work with other bureaucracies around the world because they don't know the protocols. And you have the risk of chaos and when you have such continuous turnover. And if you take the Affordable Care Act that the Obama administration has been trying to implement, trying to coordinate, and the website problems they had, that's a pretty good example of how new employees can try to bring about major change so fast that it overwhelms the bureaucratic procedures of the federal government.
Professor Peterson, how would you sum up our discussion of the historical evolution of U.S. bureaucracies?
Well, all bureaucracies have problems, as we have discussed in part one. But the United States bureaucracy has special problems because of its dubious ancestry. Nobody thinks very much of the federal government. Because of the fact it was built on a spoils system, so you have this patronage system that's part of what American government is. And because the civil service reforms started at the bottom, worked themselves up, and left that high-level patronage system intact with the inners and outers who, for all their gifts, all their energy, all their intelligence, tend to make mistakes.
In the third and last part of the bureaucracy lecture, we're going to talk about iron triangles.